All right, everyone, welcome back to the God Attachment Healing Podcast. We're entering season 2, and hopefully you get to see some new things, new faces, new interviews, and great topics, all dealing with God attachments. And today I want to introduce a very special guest, Rita Blevin, and she is going to talk about attachment and how her attachment to God was impacted by her life experience. And I'm going to give her some time to share in a little bit. But as always, if you're listening to the show, first of all, thank you. One of the encouraging things about today's interview is that Rita has listened to a number of episodes, and she's also on the path to writing a book, or it's about to be launched. So she's going to share a little bit more about that. So I'm happy to have her on, and we're talking about attachment. We're talking about Jesus, and we're talking about how he's changed our lives. So Rita, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I absolutely love it. It's valuable content. So thank you for everything that you do.
Absolutely. This is, as we were talking earlier about school, this is one of the major focuses of my dissertation, God attachment. I'm trying to see what it applies with the most. But doing the podcast has been so helpful because I learn about people's stories and I get different angles as well as to where else can attachment play a role in how we attach to God. So I'm really looking forward to you sharing today. And I do want to kind of just set the stage here that first, you are an international or experienced an international parental kidnapping. And this is kind of what's led to this attachment disorder, attachment dysfunction, maybe in a sense, and led to the writing of your book, Canyons and Fireworks. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But as we start, we'll go ahead and begin here with you introducing just anything that you want the audience to know about you, Rita. I know I just gave a brief intro, but anything that you would like for them to know before we get started.
Sure. I live in the Charlotte, North Carolina area with my husband and stepdaughter. And, we just love to have fun, love to sing and dance and be goofy. And it's really their love that makes me want to share this story, because had I not gotten the attachment healing that I needed, I would be missing out on all of this wonderful family time. And so I just want more people to get past their attachment dysfunction so that they can experience all the joy that I'm experiencing.
Good. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because in the church, at least during the time that I grew up, I don't know what it was like for you, but psychology just in general was seen as a very negative thing to talk about in the church or bring to the church. Now, I understood from my pastor's perspective because he was maybe going to school like in the 60s or 70s, and he was introduced to a lot of the secular psychology, Freud and so on. So that was very heavy at that time. But I think as the years have gone by and now Christian counseling is starting to make an impact or starting to gain more ground, attachment theory really makes a lot of sense for what we're talking about, how we attach to God, how we attach to people, and how we view them and ourselves. And, that kind of leads to this first question about, what caused your attachment issue, or how would you define an attachment issue?
So to answer the first part of your question, the cause in my case came from an international parental kidnapping. And that sounds super dramatic, but basically what happened is my parents met and fell in love in California. My mom was a natural-born American citizen, and my father was an immigrant from Mexico. And while they were married, he obtained the status of legal resident, but not legal citizen. And then when I was a baby, their marriage fell apart and they decided to get a divorce. And my father was afraid that he would have no rights against a full-blown citizen. And so out of fear, he took me and fled to Mexico and severed all ties with my mom and my mom's side of the family. And so it was the 80s, and there was really nothing that my mother could do to get me back. She, contacted the authorities, and they basically said, well, he's the father. He has the right to do that. Fortunately, my dad and his family were very loving and I spent 2 years in Mexico. Even though I'm an American citizen, my first language was Spanish because I was there from the time I was a baby until the time I was 3 years old. And I bonded with his big family. He's one of 11 children.
Wow.
And just had that big Hispanic Mexican family love.
Hmm.
And then my mom got me back.
Hmm.
She got me back when I was 3 years old.
Oh,
And
wow.
she too was afraid that my father would once again take me to Mexico. So she fled to her hometown in Western Pennsylvania and changed my name so that my father could never find me, and severed all ties with him and my Mexican family. And so my first memories are being, 3, 4 years old in a new country, surrounded by people speaking a language that I didn't understand, and placed in a family that I wasn't familiar with, nor did I look like, because the Mexican
Mm.
features certainly outweighed my mom's Slovenian features. And so naturally that created an attachment issue. I didn't have any time to form a lasting bond with any of my primary caregivers.
Mm.
And probably what's worse is that I actually did bond with my dad and his side of the family for those 2 years, but then I was taken from them.
Hmm.
And it was all out of love. My dad took me to Mexico because he wanted to be with me, and my mom took me to her hometown because she wanted to protect me and be with me. So it was all done out of love, but it still created a pretty extreme attachment issue in me.
Hmm. How was it evident to you, Rita, at that time? Because that's pretty young to remember a lot of those things. How did it affect like your childhood? What do you remember from your childhood in regards to how you attach to people?
The main thing is that I always felt out of place, and I would sort of be a chameleon to fit in. I actually fit in everywhere. I had made friends easily, and I got along with people, but I never felt like I fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no secrets. I grew up knowing just about everything about what transpired between my parents. Naturally, they couldn't hide it from me because I had memories of learning English.
Mm.
And so I grew up with the knowledge of what had happened, and common sense will tell you, even without psychology, that would probably make you feel like a little bit of an outsider.
Yeah.
But it was pretty extreme. It was intense. And my mom is also from a large family. By American standards, she's one of five.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandparents had a 100-acre farm, and they gave their kids land on the farm. So I grew up with aunts and uncles and cousins all around, and yet I still just couldn't feel like I belonged there. Even though I consciously knew the reasoning, I couldn't get past it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can imagine that being a huge factor in maybe how you related as a teenager. Now, it sounds like you ended up having a good relationship with both parents, or did that shift at some point during young college years or teenage years? How was that for you growing up?
Yeah, so growing up, I tended to bond more with friends than I did with my family. And when I speak of my family, I speak of my mom's side of the family because after 3 years old, my dad and his family were no longer in my life. Um,
Mm.
Fortunately, I was able to reconnect with them later, but while I was growing up, I didn't have any relations with them. And and so I tended to always feel more like I fit in with friends, which is dangerous in the teenage years because
Mm.
usually teens aren't making the best decisions. So I definitely got involved in the party lifestyle and made some bad decisions as a teenager. And not to say that I wouldn't have had those problems if it weren't for my attachment issue, but I think it made me just more of a classic case of being able to kind of leave the family behind and get in with, maybe not the worst crowd, but not the best crowd, and make some of those bad decisions. And it's a classic tale here in the United States, but at the same time, I think my attachment issue made me more susceptible to those pitfalls.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when I think about, you mentioned just being in the teenage years where we often tend to look for some sense of safety, And, no matter really what it is that we're looking for is acceptance. And friends typically do that well. And then we start doing things that maybe we didn't want to. But what was it like? I know religion or Christianity plays a huge role in how we're brought up. So what was that like? So after three, being with your mom, how did you grow up? Did you grow up in the church? Was your mom not saved? What was that like?
So I grew up, it's funny that I didn't grow up in the church, but I grew up in Christian counseling, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm.
So my mom's family is Christian,
Hmm.
but my grandmother was the main leader and she had some church hurt. And so
Hmm.
she didn't believe that you needed to be in church to be a Christian. And so she wasn't in church, but she taught me about Jesus and she taught me about prayer and she taught me about reading the Bible. But we very sporadically went to church, and we went to different denominations. So there was no level of consistency or security there.
Hmm.
Um, but to my mother's credit, she got me in professional Christian counseling when I was about 13 or 14 years old.
Oh, wow.
So everything that you described about Christianity not really being accepting with to psychology was not my reality
Mm,
because I was more so in counseling, Christian counseling, than I was in the church.
mm,
And so it was just very normal for me. I would, at a
right.
very young age, would just talk about you know, codependency and depression and all of those things that you learn about in counseling. So
Mm,
it's always just been my norm
mm-hmm.
to pair the two.
Sure.
I I sort of think of counseling. I think Christian counseling is maybe what some of the scriptures are talking about when it says get wisdom. We can know that we need to love, but we really need tools to learn how to love well. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's the main thing that Christian counseling taught me.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way that you learned about attachment was through that whole counseling experience.
Hmm. Yep. So when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I don't know that the term attachment was ever used or that it was ever, told to me that I had an attachment disorder, but it was basically explained.
Right.
And then later, I've pretty much been in counseling my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And later in my 20s, I was able to articulate, okay, I have an attachment issue. Back then we said disorder, but now nobody says disorder. They say issue. But I would definitely classify my issue as more of a disorder. It was pretty extreme.
Mm. And in what ways? Because I know that can look differently for different people. So when we talk about attachment, right, we have the anxious, we have the avoidant, we
Mhm.
have the what's called disorganized style. So
Mhm.
we have all these different styles. Where did you land on that? I'm curious.
I landed on avoidant.
Really? Okay.
Um, yeah, pretty clearly landed on avoidant. So I, again, consciously loved my family,
Mm-hmm.
but it was hard for me to feel or receive love.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that they loved me and I knew that I loved them, but it was more of a mental thing than a feeling or warmth or security.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much my earliest childhood goals was to leave home and I wouldn't have been able to articulate this at the time, but to take care of myself, to
Mm-hmm.
you know, take care of my own needs and not have to rely on anybody. And that's classic
Mm-hmm.
avoidant attachment. And I had those thoughts at a very, very young age to just sort
Mm-hmm.
of leave the big family farm and all the family, even though I loved them. I wasn't mad. It's just naturally what I was drawn to.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the things, and I mean, you labeled it correctly, like this idea of more independence
Mhm.
and being out on your own, and not really fully depending on people, because at some point they may fail you. Typically,
Mhm.
nobody has a high view of self, a lower view of others. But when you're talking about loving family and so on, it's usually when we're real close to people that we start to see the attachment style actually start to sprout up, right? So
Mhm.
I'm curious, as you continue to grow older or grow into your college years, what was that like? Because that's another stage where now we're looking for close relationships. We're looking for romantic relationships.
Mhm.
So what did that look like for you? Were you still kind of standoffish, or where did you start to see
Mhm.
the healing, I guess, take place?
I was definitely standoffish in my early 20s. It was more so noticed by others. We kind of walk through life and we have sort of these reoccurring themes that people notice. So for me, I always heard, you're so independent. You're such a hard worker. You're not like other girls. You don't put up with bad behavior in dating, which all sounds really positive, but let's face it, in the early 20s, there's probably going to be some bad behavior in dating that doesn't necessarily warrant completely cutting the person off.
Mm,
And I was that person that always just cut people off the second they made the slightest mistake. And for some of the older people around me, they viewed that as a strength. And for me,
mm,
it was more based out of my attachment issues. I broke up with people that I was dating, men that I was dating pretty cruelly and pretty abruptly.
mm,
Um, and it was praised. It was a characteristic that was praised. I wasn't getting involved with a loser or somebody who didn't care about
mm,
me. But I also wasn't learning, the give and take of relationships and being vulnerable
mm,
and realizing my own mistakes. It was always just, well, he messed up, I'm done with him, moving on to the next thing.
mm.
So it really didn't begin to change until later in my 20s when I had the opportunity to reconnect with my Mexican family.
Mm-hmm. And really, that's great that you brought that up because that's what I was going to ask about. Because Mexican culture, so I'm of Mexican heritage as well. I was born in the States, have Mexican heritage. So we've been experiencing both cultures, right? We grew up with
Mhm.
both cultures, we understand them well. So one of the things that you mentioned, like from a Hispanic perspective, like that idea of cutting people off, that makes a lot of sense and it doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Right.
Because don't
Uh-huh.
let people hurt you is kind of the stance, but also we're a very community oriented
Mhm.
heritage.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering to see, because we will use this to leap into how does this affect our attachment to God? Because for most Mexicans or Latinos, they have a strong Catholic heritage,
Mhm.
background. And typically it's very standoffish. It's I go to church on Sunday, repent of my sin, and then go on to live my life throughout
Mhm.
the rest of the week. So that's how my dad grew up, and he talked to me a lot about that. But he got saved when I was 2, so I never saw all of that, but I do see
Right.
that strong Catholicism within our culture. So I'm curious to know, yeah, how did you make sense of both of those worlds, having that Mexican background and also growing up, here in the States as an American?
So that's interesting. So even though my mom is Slovenian, she's of Slovenian descent, she,
Mm.
when I was growing up, was, and I don't know how else to say this, but was kind of like a Mexican wannabe because she had she had married my father and of course fell in love with him and had me, but she also fell in love with the culture. And she
Mm.
later became a Spanish teacher.
Really? Wow.
And
Okay.
she just embraced
Mm.
the Mexican culture, and she's actually remarried to a Mexican now. So
Wow.
I very much so had that Mexican American upbringing,
Mhm.
even though my father wasn't in the picture until my in my 20s, really.
Mm.
But yeah, it's funny because even though my mom was a Mexican wannabe, like I like to say, I think a lot of my personality was developed in those 2 years that I was in Mexico because I tended to just have more of the Mexican mindset as far as, which it sounds funny because I was avoidant, but I was more affectionate
Mhm.
and wanted to, linger, if that makes sense. Whenever there was a gathering, a family gathering, I wanted it to just continue, which I know
Mm.
that sounds like a contradiction, but I think it has more to do with the heritage and what I experienced in those formative years, even though I had no conscious memory of being in Mexico and having the long gatherings and the affection, it was in me somehow.
Mhm.
And I know we don't fully know the science on that. I've heard that some studies suggest that the vast majority of your personality is developed by the time you're 3. So it makes sense to me that a lot of the things that I held dear were developed during those times.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And culture makes a big difference.
Mhm.
Parental upbringing makes a big difference. One of the things that I'm starting to see now in the work that I do, I work with a lot of college students, but maybe up to 3 years ago, we rarely saw any Hispanic students. And within the
Mhm.
last 3 years, every year it's been increasing, increasing, and increasing more. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking to myself, like, what's going on? This is good. What's going on in the Latino community that's allowing for this to kind of happen? That our parents more accepting of it? Because I think growing up, it was always, do it yourself, be strong, tough it out, which I think has some good elements to it. And then
Right.
you mentioned the
Mhm.
aspect of wanting to be around people. So physically, we understand from a Latino perspective, like physically you want to be close, but emotionally, we're not really
Mhm.
close to people, but we're very
Mhm.
affectionate, very caring with each other, wanting to keep the community together. But what I've realized is that we don't know or fail to see how to be um, emotionally and even in some ways mentally connected to each other. And that does transfer over to our relationship with God. So I know as you talked about your story, I'm seeing all these different elements to it. And now I guess I want to see or hear about the breakthrough. What was the breakthrough where it made you transition? Okay, now I need God. Where's Jesus in all of this? This does not seem like he's anywhere near me right now. But what was that breakthrough for you?
So it's kind of funny, when you hear my story, you would think that that breakthrough came later, but
Hmm,
that breakthrough actually came before I was ever diagnosed with an attachment issue
hmm,
when I was 8 years old. So my mom remarried and was pregnant with my sister, and it was the 90s. And so any pregnancy over 30 years old was considered high risk pregnancy. It's not that way anymore, but it was then. And I somehow heard that and was very concerned and prayed about my mom's pregnancy every single night without telling an adult, without
hmm,
having an adult help me. And I started to have dreams about my little sister. And what's funny is that my mom was told she was having a boy.
hmm,
Again, this was the 90s before the blood test, I guess, where they know for sure.
hmm,
And it was this big happening in my family because my mom was concerned that I was getting a little too excited about having a sister and I was going to be disappointed. But
hmm,
my grandmother discerned that I was having these dreams from the Lord
hmm,
and encouraged me. And for the better part of 9 months, I prayed and had dreams about my sister. And then she was born and she was a girl.
hmm,
And so I had that connection with God before I really truly understood that I had a problem connecting with people, particularly
hmm,
my family. So, like I said,
hmm,
I easily connected with people outside of my family, but it was mainly my family that I had trouble connecting with. And,
hmm.
I sort of reflect on the sovereignty of God because by answering my prayers as an 8-year-old, he not only answered my prayers and connected me to him, because, when you're 8 years old and you know something that nobody else knows, everybody thinks it's a boy and you know that it's a girl, you're pretty sold out for Jesus at that point.
Mm,
But also in reflection, I realized because he's the great counselor.
mhm,
He was forging a bond with me and my sister
mm,
divinely, because I had all of these dreams about her personality and future conversations we'd have and her big eyes and her long legs. And I loved my sister before she was born.
mhm,
And I was the kid that couldn't connect to my loving family.
mm,
So it was really a divine breakthrough from the beginning, even though
mhm.
I didn't understand that that's what
Okay.
was happening. It was in counseling and through some pretty intense counseling sessions that I was able to draw from that experience, if
Mhm,
that makes sense, and to build on my healing from there.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that it was hard for you to connect with your family. So was the transition to connecting with your sister easier and was it much more natural for you or how was that?
It was supernatural because I felt like I knew her by the time she was born.
Mm,
And like I said, it was a divine connection because I had loving family members, and the connection wasn't there. It wasn't until this experience with my sister.
Hmm.
Fast forward into my 20s, and I reconnect with my Mexican family,
Hmm.
and it brought so much healing connecting with them that when I came back from my trip to Mexico, I was suddenly then able to connect with my American family. It was like a void had been filled
Hmm.
that then allowed my guard to come down with my American family. I didn't know I had a guard up. I
Hmm.
didn't know.
Yeah.
I knew that I had suffered traumatic separation, but I didn't understand that there was a wall created within me. I just was trying to hit up against the wall
Hmm.
without realizing that the wall was there, if that makes sense. And my trip to Mexico just brought that wall down. And
Hmm.
of course, I've had lots of counseling sessions and can understand it a little bit more, but in the moment, it was just very natural once I connected with my Mexican family.
Oh yeah, I mean that makes a huge difference. I'm imagining that your counselor was a very important figure in your life. You know, they kind of become the new stable attachment in a sense.
Mhm.
Um, and because they were that for you, was it easier to see God differently through that relationship, or did you see God differently because of your relationship with your parents? Like, what was your view of God during from that time moving
Mhm.
forward? Was it always positive? Did it change?
It
Yeah.
was always positive. It was more
Okay.
like God was my friend that told me secrets, but there wasn't any discipleship because I didn't grow up in the church. And so even though I knew about prayer and I knew about God, I didn't know that you could pray just on the regular without being in trouble. I
Mm.
didn't know, I was the kid who prayed because I thought my mom's pregnancy was a high risk pregnancy. I
Mhm.
didn't pray just to commune with God, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Mhm.
So God was always that hero that ran in and saved me whenever I cried out to him in prayer, which is something. I mean, I'm glad that I had that in my upbringing. It wasn't until I started to connect with my Mexican family that I started to really engage in the disciplines of the faith and
Mm.
really understand that, we're to pray without ceasing. We're
Mhm.
to abide under the presence of the Lord and to abide in the Holy Trinity and to engage our mind, body, and spirits with the Lord, not just cry out to him for help when you're in trouble. And so, which I wasn't, as a kid that didn't feel secure, I cried out to him a lot. So
Mm.
it wasn't a matter of not crying out to him very much, but it was a matter of always just looking to him as sort of the hero, as
Mhm.
opposed to a sovereign God who deserves my worship and who deserves my
Mm.
reverence. And then, naturally, reading the scriptures as more than just a story, but really digging in deeper and getting some deeper meaning and really applying it to life. That all happened while I was reconnecting with my family.
Mm.
And I think it's because I saw God as my friend, which he is, but he's also our good father. And
Mhm.
so when I reconnected with my father and he was good, then I was able to see that side of God as well.
Mm. That's so great. It's really good. And to be able to have that after all those years that have passed and to be able to reconnect like that. I mean, yeah, what was that like to reconnect with your dad after so many years? Did you
It
guys
was
keep in
actually
touch or?
It was actually pretty amazing. So my uncle Nathan reached out to my uncle on my mom's side
Mhm.
right when I was about graduating high school. So I didn't know this, of course, at the time, but my Mexican family did not approve of my father's actions either. They believed that a child should be with its mother and in its own country. But they also weren't going to kick my dad out, so they
Mhm.
supported him, but they didn't agree with it. When my
Mhm.
mom got me back, they made the family decision to not try to contact me until I was of age.
Wow.
And so they contacted me right about when I was turning 18. And
Wow.
yeah, we had a great phone call. And, I will say that I really have to credit my mom because she really laid the foundation for a good reunification. So my dad's family is Protestant Christian, which is super rare in
Mm,
Mexico.
mhm,
And my great grandfather was actually a pastor that founded, I think something like 12 or 13 churches. So their faith is they're a faith-filled family.
mm,
And growing up, my mom was very honest about everything that had transpired, and she would tell me, you know, because my dad did get involved with some drugs and alcohol, and so that was part of why he made some bad decisions.
mm,
But my mom told me, don't worry, by the time you're old enough, your family will have prayed him straight.
mm,
And if
mhm,
by some reason that's not the case, the rest of the family is worth knowing, but you just need to be old enough. So she told that to me the entire time I was growing up. So
mm,
I was very receptive to reconnect with them, even though I was dramatically unprepared
mm.
when it actually happened. I was dramatically unprepared, but God's sovereignty worked it all out.
Wow, that's awesome, Rita. That's a it's great, great story of reconnection, reconciliation. That's great. As I think about your story, I wonder, what kind of barriers you encountered towards the healing, because the healing seems to have been gone progressively well,
Mhm.
but that there were some moments that may have made it a little bit difficult. What were your major obstacles?
So even though I'm super grateful that I was in Christian counseling,
Hmm.
in a way, it kind of made my attachment issue the status quo, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. So it was
Mm,
something I was very aware of. It was something I knew that I would have to face one day. But at the same time, it was explained to me it's because of what happened to you
mm,
in the first few years of your life. So, as a teenager and young adult, you think, well, there's really nothing, even if I couldn't articulate it, I subconsciously thought, well, it's because of what happened to me. So there's really nothing I can do about it.
mm,
Um, Even though I was learning tools in counseling, there was sort of an underlying belief that it's just the status quo. It's just a label that I've gotten. Now,
mhm.
my counselor would have been horrified if I would have been able to articulate that. And I'm sure would have undone that, but I couldn't even articulate it at that
Mm,
time. It was just sort of in the back of my mind that, well, this is just the status quo. And
mm,
it wasn't until my early 20s that I read Dr. John Townsend's Hiding from Love,
mm,
which is an amazing resource, specifically for avoidant attachment. And the main takeaway I had from it was that, sure, you suffered a trauma that has caused you to have an unhealthy attachment style,
mhm,
but now it's about addressing the habits that you've formed in coping with that trauma. And
mm,
I know that sounds super simple, but it was, even though I had been in counseling and even though I had a lot of knowledge, it was the first time I realized that I had bad habits in regard
mm,
to pushing people away and shutting down and emotionally self-isolating. Um, and it was overwhelming. It was
mm,
like the weight of the world came tumbling down on me. It was really overwhelming. And I actually sort of stepped away from inner healing during that time.
mm,
But fortunately, that was right at the time when I was reuniting with my family. So even though I wasn't actively seeking inner healing, just because I was so overwhelmed by it,
mhm,
the Lord was orchestrating encounters with my family to help bring that
mhm.
healing.
Wow. Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I haven't heard about that book from Townsend, but it sounds really, really interesting. And you said it's specific for avoidant attachment?
Yeah, he proposes that we all hide from love
Mm,
on some level.
mm,
Um, And I see that, because of the fall,
Hmm.
we Adam and Eve hid. So I believe we all do on some level hide from love, but it is also for the avoidant attachment, the
Yeah.
person with a healthy avoidant attachment. So it's really a good resource for anybody who wants to love better
Okay.
and be more vulnerable. But for me, it really showed me that I had some really bad habits and that it was up to me to change them, that it wasn't just about what happened in my past. It was about me taking ownership of my life. And
Hmm.
that sounds super inspiring, but it was not at the time. It
Right.
was it was
Yeah.
super overwhelming and a
Yeah.
little bit daunting. Yeah.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking about that, because I think growing up for me, I landed more on the anxious attachment style. And even then there were specific situations, even as an adult, where that anxiety would kick in, um,
Mm,
which would make me worry, just overthink
mm,
and become wanting to control certain things around me, because if I didn't have control, my anxiety would go up. So there's all these things that we start to see each other. You mentioned having bad habits. For those who maybe have an avoidant attachment style, what are some of those bad habits? Because they might kind of have that same feel of, I wasn't aware. I just knew that I wouldn't get close to people, or
mm.
I pushed people away in some sense or way, shape, or form. If you're willing to share, like
Sure.
one or two habits that could maybe help people see through and say, hey, I have that. Am I being avoidant because I'm displaying that same habit or behavior?
Sure. So it's funny, it's going to sound like a contradiction. In one sense, I was a very good listener because I would try to gather data about my loved ones to feel connected to them. So I was
Hmm.
a great resource for Christmas presents because I always knew what everybody wanted because I was listening.
Hmm.
Um, but in another sense, if I heard something I didn't like, I would shut down and sort of willfully not hear.
Hmm.
And that really goes back to the fact that there was a trauma. So even though an unhealthy avoidant attachment style is something that needs to be addressed, as you know, it's really a built-in protection mechanism that God put in place, I believe, to from getting more trauma. So so it's the trauma response of shutting down so you don't have further stress or trauma. And so there's just a super easy switch to shut off in the person that has an avoidant attachment style. I hope I explained that right.
Hmm.
But, basically, I would just, without knowing it, could shut people off or shut people out. Not just say, okay, that person's not safe anymore, so I'm not going to deal with them, but just in the middle of a conversation, stop listening. And
Hmm.
that's a really bad habit.
Hmm.
That's a very bad habit because I equated just normal interpersonal stress with trauma
Hmm.
because I hadn't dealt with my trauma.
Hmm.
So any level of stress was put in the danger trauma category. So
Hmm.
you say something I don't like, shut it off.
Hmm.
An aunt would be complaining about traffic, shut it off. And then I wouldn't hear the moments after that, of
Hmm.
that were necessary for me to feel love. And so that was a big one for me is just realizing how naturally I shut the switch off, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you made that distinction because just to clarify to the audience, there is a difference between a trauma response, which is what you were talking about, shutting down, your body starts to shut down or feeling disconnected and so on, and having an avoidant attachment style. So for those of you who are listening, so you may have experienced a traumatic event which has caused certain responses or symptoms within your relationships. But an avoidant attachment style is the idea of, do I view people as safe, right? It comes back to this idea of
Mhm.
safety. And if you don't view people as safe, then why am I going to share my life with you? I'd rather keep a
Mhm.
distance. I'm going to gather some information that's necessary for me to hear. But if I don't need it, then I'm not going to bother with it. Plus, you're not trustworthy, right? It's not explicit like that, but our behavior kind of communicates that to other people sometimes. So we have this
Exactly.
other part of it where we're very accomplished and doing all these different things, but also wanting to maintain that distance. But yeah, I mean, working with a lot of trauma, there are those different types of responses. But the place where you'll really see your attachment style be come to fruition is in the closeness of relationships. So if you're anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, whatever the attachment style that you hold to, really just take a look at your closest relationships. When people want to get close to you, how do you respond in those instances? Because for the most part, many of us do very well with people who are not that close to us.
Mhm.
But when you are in close proximity, that's really when you start to see your attachment style. You can ask those questions of, okay, where is this coming from? Why am I shutting down? Why do I feel anxious about this? It comes down to this idea of safety and security. But that was a great point that you made about um, uh, having those trauma responses. Like, okay, I shut down. And that's a subtle thing too. Like, it's really hard to see
Mhm.
those subtle changes, like, oh, I shut down, right? So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. It's really good.
And just to add, the other one that comes to mind is I had to come to the realization that I was transparent, but not vulnerable. Because,
Mm,
I learned from counseling, you have to open up, you have to share in order to have intimacy. So I would share details, but I
mm,
really wouldn't be vulnerable and share the feeling behind those
that's good.
details.
Yeah.
And so it sounds so similar, and you can really live in denial. You can
Hmm.
really live in denial and say, well, I'm a good listener and I'm vulnerable, and really not be. And those were the two major bad habits that I had to break.
Hmm. Yeah. No, and that transitions into, and I wonder if you saw this as well in your relationship with God, is that also we could be praying to God and sharing with God about, these details of our lives, which He knows all of that, right?
Mhm.
And because we share that, we feel close to Him. But when
Mhm.
we walk in our daily lives, it's opposite to what His word says, or we're, entertaining something that we shouldn't be entertaining, and so on. So sometimes people will be in that state where, similar to relationships, we'll be sharing all these things with God or doing things for God, but not really being close to Him or drawing close to His heart. And part of attachment security is God safe? And if we don't deal with that reality of, sometimes bad things happen and it's all under God's providence, but He still cares for us. He still loves us,
Exactly.
right? We come back to that truth. Um, but yeah, Rita, what are some last things that you would share with someone who may be struggling with their attachment style, whether it be anxious, avoidant, doesn't matter what it is. What are some words of encouragement that you've had that you've learned from your life that God has taught you throughout your life experience?
I would just say that God cares more about your future and your relationships than you do. And He
Mm.
is more than happy to walk you through a customized,
Mm.
design, divine, personal healing journey, whatever your situation is. If you can get involved in counseling, Christian counseling, I think that you should. If you can read books, I think that you should. But if for whatever reason you can't do those things, God is able. God
Mm.
is able to walk you through and to provide good counsel, even if it's not professional Christian counseling. I think if you can afford it and if you have the means, I think you should explore professional Christian counseling. But God is sovereign. And, when I look back at my journey, I can link certain aspects directly to professional Christian counseling. And then there are other aspects of the healing journey that were completely God. And I was oblivious at the time, but in retrospect, was able to see, okay, that healed this part of my heart. And
Mm.
then I was able to move forward. And so I just believe that, that God is sovereign. And if you want healing in this area, God will walk you through it.
Mm. I often think, and I mentioned this on the podcast before, where sometimes what stops the growth is us wanting the immediate results. But I think one of the
Yeah,
common themes that we see throughout scripture and we see throughout our own lives is that we never know the point or the relevance of the suffering until later down the road when we're able to look
right.
back and say, oh, that makes sense why I had to go through that to learn this and so on.
Mhm.
So we will save ourselves a lot of time and heartache in learning to trust God and pray to him during those times where we don't get it, and being okay with that.
Right.
Right. Lord, I don't understand why this is happening. I don't get it. And it hurts even more sometimes when you feel like you've been doing everything right. Where you
Oh,
feel
yeah.
like I've been doing everything right. What's going on? Why am I getting A11? Well, that's what I ordered. Right. And we kind of get into these modes where, Lord, I've done what you asked me to. I didn't get this result. Why?
Right.
I think God appreciates that honesty and being able to share with him those moments. Why we're not seeing his hand. We'll see it later down the road as you referenced.
That's
So
why they call it faith.
yes, exactly, right.
It
Yes,
is faith, and we forget that so easily.
absolutely. And thinking about Hebrews and thinking about all the Old Testament patriarchs, when they would look back, they were promised that they were going to see the
Mhm.
the promise of God, and some of them didn't because it was Jesus. And then after
Right.
that, we get to see that and be able to experience that, and yeah, and have this different attachment to God. So, Rita, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate your insights and you
Thank you for
sharing your
having me.
story. Yeah. Any final comments that you'd like to share?
Just one, and it's really inspired by my husband because he was concerned that I might not offer hope for people who don't have the possibility of reuniting with their family of origin.
Mm-hmm.
And I just look to scripture, and I've always related most to Daniel and Joseph. Both of them were separated from their families.
It's
Both
true.
of them suffered under tyrannical rulership, and
Mm-hmm.
both of them later thrived with the Lord. Joseph got to reunite with his family, and that was part of his redemptive story. But we don't have any scriptural proof that Daniel got to. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty much assumed that Daniel's parents were killed by Nebuchadnezzar. But yet he still had a wonderful life and did amazing things with the Lord. And so I would just say that, again, God has in store for anybody who wants it a customized divine healing journey. And it doesn't have to look like mine. I just hope that by sharing my story, I can encourage people to seek the Lord.
Well, thank you, Rita. One of the blessings that I have doing the podcast is being able to learn from the guests. And thank you for sharing and learning from you as well as you shared about your story. For those of you who are listening, I'll be releasing this episode as part of season 2, and I look forward to you guys listening to it. And remember to subscribe. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rita.